Welcome to the audio bike tour of the Frenchtown area. Please begin on the corner of Frenchtown and Tillinghast, going straight onto Frenchtown Road. The history of the Frenchtown area and Frenchtown Road. The area of Frenchtown was founded in the 1680s. The bounds of the first settlement were from South County Trail to Frenchtown Road all the way to the West Greenwich line and finally to the Exeter line. Its name comes from the French ancestry that settled in this area. The small group that settled here was known as Huguenots or French Protestants. They had originally peacefully settled in France thanks to King Henry IV, who in 1598 signed the Edict of Nantes giving them rights to the nation, yet in 1685 King Louis XIV repealed this order. These people were forced to leave France because of their religion. They were seen as outcasts. They were persecuted and then exiled out of France, some ending up in Frenchtown. Once they arrived, this group bought land from a group called the Atherton Group. They built homes, a meeting house, and a mill to grind grain on this land. They also cleared meadows to plant orchards of apples, grapes, and honey locusts. What they did not know was that the group they purchased land from never really owned the land, making their deeds to the land fraudulent. This only became a problem 5 years later. American settlers who had the actual deeds from the colony pushed the Huguenots out. Many left. Instead, they joined other settlements in New York and Massachusetts. Only 2 families were able to stay. Following the violent clash over the disputed land, one person that was able to stay was Moses Money. His son Peter Money also stayed, and during his life, he remained in Rhode Island and served in both the East Greenwich and Providence militias, and in 1747 he had become a colonel. On May 6, 1714, East Greenwich, Rhode Island, Peter Money married Mary Tillinghast until her death in 1726, when he then married her sister Mercy Tillinghast in 1728. The Lemoynes were able to keep their land in Frenchtown for generations. Dr. Pierre Hérault also remained, his children marrying into well-known Rhode Island families. As fast as the French Huguenots settled here in Rhode Island, they were forced to move. Yet, we still keep the name of Frenchtown to this day. Today, the area where they settled is known as Camp Fogarty, South County Trail. 1265, Frenchtown Road, right between where Frenchtown Road and Tillinghast Road meet, sits Place Farm. This building has been here since 1830. Arba J. Place and his wife, Betsy Johnson Place, lived there and worked on the farm during the 1950s. 1300, Frenchtown Road, the New England Museum of Wireless and Steam Inc. This museum has many antique steam engines. One of these engines is a coreless engine, the only working one. 1633, Frenchtown Road, Giles Pierce House, or the Ancient Farmhouse. Built by Giles Pierce, the grandson of Giles Pierce, one of the founders of East Greenwich. Due to wetlands throughout Frenchtown, the house had a long 1,000-foot driveway. His grandfather was prominent in the affairs of the new settlement. He would even let the meetings be held at his own house. He was town councilman from the founding of East Greenwich in 1677 until 1684. Now turn on to Shippee Road. It was discovered that Shippee Road has gone by different names before. These included Shippee Road, Narrow Lane, and finally Hamilton Corner. Ike Shippee owned Shippee Road and both sides of Tillinghast Road. He built his barn on Shippee Road. More large farms can be found mostly on Shippee Road. They take up part of South Road as well. These include Hugh Bailey with 158 acres, James Brown with 157 acres, George Foster with 97 acres, and finally partly on South Road, Henry Stanton with 51 3/4 acres. The old Josiah Jones Farm. Built in 1762 by Jones, previously known as the Kit Shippee Place. Across from this is a large cemetery, mostly of Asaph Vaughan's. Henry Madison was one of the 48 proprietors in King Philip's War, but he later sold this land to David Shippee on March 17, 1682. Another one of the 48 proprietors in King Philip's War was Thomas Nichols. The Nichols family were latecomers to Rhode Island in 1636, coming from Glamorgan, Wales. Nichols was a royalist soldier in the English Civil War and was taken prisoner at the Battle of Stow-on-the-Wold in Bristol, England. Later settling in Rhode Island, his farm was later famous because American Col William Barton captured the British General Richard Prescott at the location in 1777. During King Philip's War, Thomas Nichols used his ships to transport troops. Thomas Nichols was the third man out of the 48 to be called when receiving grants for land. Nichols never came to East Greenwich, instead staying in Newport. He later transferred the land he was given in a grant to his son in 1689. His grant totaled to be 119.5 acres of land. Sadly, later in 1940, the original house on this land was destroyed by a fire. The only thing that still stands from his original land is a stone wall. Even then, the wall is not fully there. After the death of Thomas Jr., the farm seemed to stay within the family. In 1947 and 1951, the land was purchased by Updike Real Estate Company. Now turn onto South Road. 830 South Road today is the 72 acres farm, known as the Briggs Bosch Farm. This farm was built by John Briggs in 1745, and the land on which this farm was built was first owned by his grandfather. The 72 acres were given in a land grant, yet originally it had been 144 acres. The original owner of this land never actually lived in East Greenwich and instead gave the land to his son Richard Briggs. Since 2001, the farm has been owned by the East Greenwich Land Trust. This structure throughout time has had some construction done to it. An L to the west in 1820-50 and one to the north in 1930. Upon his death, John Briggs gave the land into sections to his children. Joseph Briggs, one of John Briggs' children, had bought his siblings' share of the farms. The house was then given to his son David Briggs, who died before his father did. The house was sold to Paul Hendricks, William Herbert Church, Lillian A. White, John M. Howard, Laurette V. Shepard, William Parmenter, and Donald Merling Bosch throughout the years. As mentioned before, it was finally sold to the East Greenwich Land Trust. Heading towards 1515, South Road, previously known as the Silas Jones House. Originally, this was a purchase of 10 acres of land in 1755 by Silas Jones, a shoemaker. He also ended up purchasing 8.75 acres across the street to build his barn, where today it still stands. Silas Jones and his wife eventually gave this property to their son, also named Silas Jones. In 1778, he sold the house to George Waite Babcock. This family also ended up selling 2 other lots to Babcock. Babcock was a mariner and a veteran of the American Revolution. He had many ships that he was captain of during the war. These ships had anywhere from 40 men to 125. Alongside the men on the ships, they also had guns, though never as many as the men they had on the ship. Later in his life, George Babcock later sold the house to Gideon Gardner, who only after a year of owning this house died. So the house ended up going to James Gardner, his brother. He immediately sold the property to David Tripp. This house since then has been sold to many different owners. Their names include Jenkins Jones, Benjamin Jones, John Brown, Christopher Allen Shippee, Phones W. Tarbox, and Charles Herbert Shippee. Jr. Today the house is and has been owned by Peter A. Young since 1975. And finally, please turn onto Tillinghast Road. On Frenchtown Road, there is the Tillinghast Mill site, formerly known as Mount Hope Factory. This factory produced cotton yarn initially. This mill was established in 1814 and operated until 1905. Thomas Holden and Job Card bought this mill in 1840, not too long after both parties sold their shares. Thomas Holden leased his to Zachariah Parker, who within 2 years quit, leaving Holden to sell his share of the mill to Giles Spencer. Job Card sold his to A. Lyman Place. In 1871, the mill site was purchased by Mr. Ben Moon. The mill was then converted into a carpet mill. During this year, an iron wheel replaced the wooden overshot wheel that had been used for the previous 57 years. Then later again replaced with a brass turbine. Later it began to produce printed cloth, carpet, and twine. There were no more than 25 worker houses built on this site since so many of the workers were children whose parents lived nearby. In the year 1912, the mill was bought and things from it were sold by Thomas Baker. This had been the first cotton mill in East Greenwich. Built by Dr. Thomas Tillinghast and later run by Allen Tillinghast and Joseph Jocelyn Tillinghast. These two would lease the mill to others. The mill was originally 2 stories tall. Once it began to produce other products, it was built onto, later becoming 4 stories tall. The bottom 2 were made of stone and the top 2 were made of wood. Today this mill site can be found within the Frenchtown Park of East Greenwich. This park includes trails with a pond and bridges that will lead to the Tillinghast Mill site. Next on 599, Tillinghast Road is the green, Tillinghast Farm built in 1780. The farm is west of the house. Today the farmland northwest of the building is used as a Christmas tree farm and has been since 1959. Today the historic building has been altered, with an addition of a second entrance and a shed dormer. Today known as 864, Tillinghast Road was the Daniel Briggs house. This house has been built in sections. The first was built sometime before 1717. It could have been as early as 1702. Other work was done to the house in 1725. Built in 1785, on Tillinghast Road was a house between Middle Road and Frenchtown Road. This 130-acre farm in 1716 was owned by George Vaughan and in 1862 owned by Thomas Tillinghast. Today the house still stands, yet on the farmland other houses have been built. The 97-acre farm was owned by Daniel Briggs and purchased from Joseph Waite for £40. Daniel Briggs married Lydia Higby, with whom he has 4 daughters and 1 son. Daniel Briggs is one of the possible earliest settlers on Tillinghast Road. His son, Benjamin, inherited the dwelling house and farm. Later in 1969, the town of East Greenwich purchased a mill. The land in and around Tillinghast Road was part of a 5,000-acre grant to East Greenwich. East Greenwich was given this grant because of 48 proprietors for service in King Philip's War. Also known as the First Indian War, Metacom's War, Metacomet's War, Pometacomet's Rebellion, and finally Metacom's Rebellion. The war is named after the Wampanoag chief, Metacom. He later took the name Philip or King Philip. He took this name based on his father's friendly relationships with the Mayflower Pilgrims. This war was an armed conflict happening from 1675 until 1676. It was between indigenous inhabitants of New England and the New England colonists. Families that originally lived in this area included Green, Wanton, Bailey, Thurston, Waite, and Jones. Some of these families ended up marrying into each other. Another possible earliest settler is Hugh Bailey. Originally born in Newport, Rhode Island, Hugh Bailey moved to East Greenwich between 1696 and 1703. Notable mentions, located off of this bike tour loop: Arrow Road, previously named Snake Road. A man by the name Faith Palmer fought to have the name of the street changed to Arrow to honor Peter Arrow, a Huguenot settler. When Davisville and Arrow Road used to connect, William Allen ran a gristmill and blacksmith on the corner of these 2 roads. By 1969, this building and the entire site had been destroyed by many other things, including natural things and also graffiti. The site was then razed. In its place now stands Route 4, the reason the 2 roads no longer connect. Tillinghast House, north side of Arrow Road. This house was in between William Allen's mill and the Mumford Tillinghast House. This Tillinghast House was also known as the elder Edward Tillinghast's carting mill. George A. Vaughan purchased this land later in 1896. In the 1900s, the mill was known as the Millie Vaughan Mill. It was then a small water-powered grist mill and blacksmith shop. Since then, unfortunately, this mill site has burned down. The Mumford Tillinghast House is located off this bike loop and at the corner of South County Trail, Route 2, and Arrow Road. This house was built in 1840, yet the land was owned by Joshua Davis in 1716. Joshua Davis was also the founder of Davisville. Davis then passed the house down throughout his family. This concludes the audio bike tour of the Frenchtown area.